Thank you very much, Jeremy. My name is Ruth Redden and I'm the International Programme Manager in the College of Arts and Humanities. And today, together with Dr. Gillian Pye, who's the Associate Dean of Arts and Humanities, and Amy Smith, who's Programme Manager in the College Office, we're presenting to you about collaborative student-focused solutions in response to cancellation of exchange programmes. And I'm going to hand you over to Dr. Gillian Pye, who's going to start the presentation.
Oh, sorry. You should be able to unmute now. I'll do that for all of them.
I can unmute myself now. Thank you very much. Thank you. And thanks so much for the opportunity to speak to everybody today. It's great to be here. I just wanted to start by going back to the idea of working smart together and thinking about what that might mean. And when I think about it, I think, well, certainly it means efficiency. It means everybody doing their jobs really well and doing their jobs on time and using their resources effectively. And it smacks of a well-oiled process of things moving along nicely. And that's definitely a valid way of thinking about it. But what happens when something comes along unexpectedly and disrupts that well-oiled machine? And what we want to present today perhaps looks at it from that perspective and celebrates a slightly different slant, maybe on the idea of working smart together. And in that spirit, Ruth and Amy and I are here to represent all of the colleagues who met between May and July last year as part of our working group on exchanges in the College of Arts and Humanities. And I've got a slide here with their names on it. You can see there were quite a few of us: Paolo, Diana, Derval, Neil, Fanula, Siobhan, Naomi, Colin, Sabina, Zandrine, Stephen, Aoife, and there were many people as well, other than these people, who helped us throughout the process. So I just want to start by thanking all of those people for all of their time and all of their effort that they invested. And I know some of them are here today, so hi to everybody else who's sitting in the audience there today. I would say that our working group on outward mobility was less like a well-oiled machine and rather more like the swarm of honeybees that you could see on the first slide, because we came together around a central problem, which was the cancellation of outward mobility, the cancellation of study abroad placements for our students. And we all dispersed to collect information, which we brought back to the Hive. And crucial to the success of the project was a kind of a peer learning process, really. By bringing the information together, we were all able to appreciate the situation in a holistic way. And this had two effects. One was that we were able to come up with a solution that was student focused. And two, we all gathered knowledge which we could bring back to bear in our roles, whether those were administrative, technical, academic. So the dynamic was one of converging from multiple directions on a single point. And that single point was a one-stop shop of information and support to allow students to make the right choices for them as individuals and to continue to refine those choices in an evolving and very uncertain situation. So I think this is a really good example of the kind of people power that Mark mentioned in his introduction, what happens and what can be achieved when academic staff, administrative staff work across boundaries in the interests of students. And this makes it possible to harness and to enhance the potential of the system to work for us. Amy's going to look now in a little bit more detail at the actual problem and how we approached it. And then after that, Ruth is going to talk about the way that we communicated with students. So I'll pass over now to Amy.
Thanks very much, Gillian, and hello everyone. So as Gillian mentioned, my job is to try and showcase the collaborative staff effort in this project. So as was mentioned, following the announcement to suspend exchange programmes for autumn 2020, we were presented with the problem of what to do with students who have a compulsory year abroad built into stage 3 of their programme, or an optional international year abroad. So it was widely acknowledged that we had an obligation to clarify for these students what their options were and identify, I suppose, just some areas that the programme could genuinely deliver on, albeit in exceptional circumstances. So one of the key principles framing our discussions was safeguarding the academic progression through the programme for these students. And to that end, a working group was formed with a clear timeline of 3 weeks and an overall aim to develop a set of recommendations. So the working group itself was primarily, it was action focused, action orientated, and its focus was to work through a set of potential options that would involve the consultation with a number of key areas across the university. So finally, the outcome of all of that work would come together and seek to inform a proposal identifying robust but realistic outcomes for students and provide clarity for staff working with those students. So just moving on to the methodology. And so I just want, for this section here, I want to provide you with a very brief snapshot of how the options were identified and fleshed out by the working group. So for this section, I actually took inspiration from Agile and that post-it room that I call it, that I think many of us have spent a lot of time in that building. Again, this is just a snapshot of the methodology that was applied. And as you can imagine, like, these were discussed in great detail and all angles were explored. So a good starting point for us was to lock down the options that we knew were available to us. So drawing from existing university policies and processes, we were able to confirm the options of a leave of absence or a transfer to the 3-year degree. So it was really important to work through the pros and cons of each option and to document them clearly so that students could make the best decision for themselves based on their own personal circumstances at that time. So we then moved to workshop through some options that were less clear. So rather than think about students in the context of stages and years, we actually reframed our thinking and broke it down further by trimester. And so by reimagining the student journey by trimester, the compact exchange model option emerged. And that offered students the opportunity to take up their exchange in spring 2021. So this option meant that they could stay on in their destination country into the summer if they wished, and in doing so would further enhance their language fluency. So they would still achieve their exchange year credits by having the added requirement of an end of year project, and that was to address any shortfalls in exchange year credits. So that option would also be complemented by the added support of a reduced workload by trimester. And the goal of that was to minimize any negative impact on students' GPAs for their final year. So the final option then was the flip stage model. And in many ways, that was born out of contingency considerations for just uncertainties around the wider public health measures beyond our control. So again, we always seek to control the controllables, and that was one that unfortunately we couldn't control. So that came out of that. So the next question then was how to get there and how to find the missing pieces. So as most of us here in this virtual room know, we operate in an incredibly complex environment in UCD, which involves heavy reliance on the advice, the processes, the workflows of other key units to be able to carry out our own work in our own areas. So in order to establish if we could include all of the options with the proposal, in the proposal, we had to determine if they were robust enough to fit in and stand up to the regulatory and operational frameworks in the university, along with many other academic and logistical considerations too. So at that point in the process, it was established that the working group would need to extend the collaborative net a little further afield than that initial working group. So we went off to, we knew that we had to seek guidance from key areas across the university, and members of that group, chaired by Gillian, were given very clear collaborative assignments with these areas that you can see here on the slide. And we all know from experience of working with most things with regard to students that the devil's in the detail. And I suppose it goes without saying that without that, we needed that like really excellent support and guidance from colleagues in these areas. And by getting that support and guidance, we were able to unpack those complexities just a little bit further and reframe them in more simple terms for students. And Ruth's going to talk a little bit more about that in her section. But I suppose just to finish up, for me, the success of this project was underpinned by a real willingness of staff, not just in our college in Arts and Humanities, but across the university, to come together and have the students' best interests at heart, as well as some very skilled chairing of that initial working group. So many thanks to Gillian for that. And that's all from me. So I'm just going to pass you over to Ruth now, who's going to talk about the student experience.
Thanks, Amy. As Amy mentioned, I'm going to talk about the interactions that we had with students. When the announcement was made that exchanges were cancelled for the autumn trimester, the students understandably expected us to have instant answers, which we didn't have for the reasons outlined already, and also because we wanted to involve students in the decisions that we were making. After coming up as a group with the different options, the next step was to present them to students in a consultative manner rather than as a fait accompli. We only really fully knew our options worked when we consulted with the students, and this did involve us making a few tweaks. As a group, we wanted to empower students, for them to feel that they could make choices from a range of options, to give them an element of control at a time when they felt that there was so much happening that was outside of their control. I've worked in student support roles in UCD for many years, and I have to say that I really learned from the communication processes that we undertook with students as part of the working group. The collaborative nature of the group meant that we each took on different tasks, which I'll outline in more detail. This led to a multi-layered approach to communication, which meant that students were given the information in different ways to facilitate their understanding of the different options on the table. So, for example, quite a lengthy and detailed information document was drawn up, outlining all of the options open to students and the advantages and disadvantages of going for each option. But we recognised that this was actually quite a long document to read in detail. So we also came up with a simple infographic that the students could look at and in a glance look at the options and see maybe which option appealed to them more than another, and then go to the document to look at that option in more detail. We emailed the information document and infographic to the students along with a link and a date for a Zoom presentation or a Zoom meeting. This meant that the students had a time and a forum within which they could ask questions and seek clarification on the email information that they had received. We set up different Zoom calls by programme, so there was no confusion of students from different programmes getting differing information. At the Zoom calls, we had a high turnout, which we were very happy with. We presented the information to the students in a PowerPoint, which meant that they were getting the information orally as well as in writing. And we left plenty of time for questions and answers, which was really important because we actually did get a lot of questions. When the Zoom calls were over, we typed up the questions and answers and emailed them to the students along with the slides. And all the information was put on the website. And we also sent the students a survey to gauge their initial opinion on what they felt they were going to go for, but they had several weeks to make up their mind and give a final decision. I mentioned that there were a lot of people involved in all of this work, but to make things more streamlined and less confusing for students, we set up a dedicated UCD email address, outgoing.artshumanities@ucd.ie. So it meant that students were getting information from the one email address rather than from lots of different people. And it also meant that if a student had a question, it didn't matter if that question was academic or non-academic. They still emailed this one email address and then it was forwarded to the correct person. Most of the students were able to get the information that they needed to make their decision based on what I have talked about already. But some students had more complex situations. And with those students, we were able to have individual follow-up Zoom calls with them to talk to them in more detail to help them make up their mind. And then because we were in so much communication with the students, we were also able to identify students that weren't engaging with us at all. Thankfully, it was very few students, it was only 2 or 3. But it didn't matter what decision a student was making, even if that decision was not to go and exchange at all. the student still had to complete an action. For example, a BA International Modern Languages student would have to complete a programme transfer to the 3-year BA. The UCD targeted communication system was great for this. We sent more focused emails to these students. We could see that they had opened their emails or not. And in the end, we did actually manage to contact each student. While we awaited a university decision on whether spring mobility would go ahead or not, we still required the students to make a final decision on their options by the 5th of August, as some options, for example, leave of absence, require them to act by a particular deadline. After widespread consultation with students across the university, UMT made a decision in late October that exchanges for the spring trimester would go ahead. That meant that the compacted model that Amy talked about earlier, that was possible for it to take place. But while awaiting that decision in September and October, like the guy in the tightrope there, the students had a balancing act in terms of keeping all options open in case they weren't able to go in exchange. This is the students who were due to go who chose to go in spring 21, which was the majority of the students. And this involved, amongst other things, drawing up a detailed academic plan for different eventualities with their academic coordinators. And even when it was announced that exchanges were going ahead, pandemic-related circumstances meant that students had to change their decision from going in exchange in spring 2021 to other options. And this happened right throughout the autumn trimester and during the beginning of the spring trimester. Such circumstances included the pandemic reaching such a serious situation in their host country that they no longer felt safe to travel, or even students who really did want to go in exchange to their host country, but practical matters meant that they couldn't go. For example, Japan stopped issuing student visas, and the US Embassy stopped taking in-person appointments in the embassy, which is necessary for the issuing of student visas, which meant that those students simply couldn't go on exchange. And throughout all of this, members of the group were on hand to provide students with ongoing individual advice and support so that they still had the support that they needed to make the choice that was right for them. And I'm now going to hand you back to Gillian, who's going to talk about some of the students and the choices that they made.
Thanks, Ruth. So you can see that the initial stages of our project involved us all dispersing to come back to the centre with information that we pooled and shaped into a coherent set of choices for students. And that had the benefit of allowing those students to move forward, each in their own direction, empowered by the knowledge that we'd given them. So despite the fact that these choices have really not been easy, with many students finding themselves between a rock and a hard place, and I wouldn't want to minimise for a minute the difficulty for students in this situation, many of them have embraced the changes and the choices positively, some with really, really inspiring resilience and energy. And that brings me then to the last slide and just thinking about the impact of the project. It's been really, really powerful to see students in situations of extreme restriction taking control of their learning journeys. And I just want to give you a couple of examples of those. One student reconciled herself to staying in UCD and completing her degree without the year abroad, but now she's looking forward to hopefully spending next year as an English language assistant on the Department of Education scheme. Yet another student decided in September to take a leave of absence and to travel abroad independently, and she took an internship at a language school, and we've really seen her grow in confidence, and she zoomed in to a recent open evening to enthuse about her studies, and she's now looking forward to spending a second year abroad, hopefully on an Erasmus exchange next year. Another example is of a student who spent the autumn trimester at UCD, but she really found that she wasn't ready for final year modules. So she took a leave of absence for this trimester, and at the last count, she was planning to head to Spain to spend some time with friends before embarking on her Erasmus year next year. For the team, the journey has continued too. The knowledge that we've developed has allowed us to keep on advising students as the situation has evolved, and we're now ready to reconvene as we head towards the next set of advisories for 21-22. It's still a very uncertain situation, but we're very much steadied and bolstered by the bank of experience that we've been able to build up. And also the contingencies have brought unexpected benefits. And it's a good example of the ways in which we're not just managing crisis, but also seeking to improve and to develop things as we go along. And hopefully some of these unexpected benefits are going to allow us to work towards the future of the year abroad. And we hope that's going to become increasingly popular and increasingly possible for all students. Amy mentioned a year abroad report, which was written by students and submitted to coordinators. And that was initially intended as a kind of assessment contingency for those whose year abroad was cut short. And that actually turned out to be a really valuable way for students to share their personal insights with us, to share their experiences of the pandemic in particular, but the year abroad more generally. And it's underlined the kind of complex learning that happens on outward mobility, and it's helped us to understand how we might support students better in the future. Experiences like the one I just mentioned of the student who went abroad and took an internship in a language school have prompted us to think about looking at alternative ways for students to take a year abroad. And that's a project that we're going to be looking at over the next little while. So the future's uncertain, but we're hopeful about it. And we're very much enriched by this collaboration. And I want to thank Ruth very much for taking the initiative to sign us up for this event this morning. And I want to thank again everyone who worked with us. And that's that from us. And if you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
Thanks a million. So I'm just going to leave the chat there. So if you have questions, you can ask them and I will pass them along. There's some really interesting stuff there. I have a question, if that's okay. I might just immediately ask. So you mentioned that you had done a survey and you had tried multiple communication methods. I think it's something that we've heard multiple times, is that you need to try again and again and again to contact and communicate and make engagement work with students. So I'm just wondering if you found that there was one particular approach that worked in terms of getting students engaged with this. You mentioned that you set up a specified email address and you surveyed them after the fact, but was there anything in particular that worked, do you think, in doing this? That's for anyone on the panel, really.
I'll answer this. I actually think what worked was the fact that we tried different approaches. So some students, you know, they'll get the email, they'll read it and they'll be fine. But other students need to have it presented to them. So they need to hear somebody tell them it and have the chance to ask questions. So I think the fact that we used different approaches with students meant that they had different opportunities to take in the same information. So it wasn't like a case of sending an email out, there's the information, there you go. And also the fact then that they had lots of chances to ask questions along the way, because there were a lot of questions. It was very uncertain. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, no, it does for sure. Variety leads to success, but that's interesting. Also, and this is one for Amy. Amy, one of your reflections is the willingness of staff to come together underpinned by the focus on the students. And I'm just wondering from your own reflections, and I think Gillian mentioned that you'll do this again, there's the paradox of having to do this because you had to move to remote working, but then being able to do it because of the tools and technologies that we had to come together in a way that we didn't before. Do you think that that's something that you'll really look to use again in the future in terms of bringing groups together with a focus on the student and their experience?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, you know, looking back on it, it was kind of early days into the pandemic at that stage. So, I mean, I think we were all still kind of finding our feet with the remote, all the tools with remote working. But I suppose what made it a lot easier was just really clear agendas, really clear tasks, a really clear idea of what we were trying to do. So, I mean, I think that follows through into any form of work, whether it's remote or face-to-face, or, you know, I think we still achieved what we would have done if it were, you know, those 10, 15 people in a room, or over a screen. I think, you know, the work got done, and the key thing is that it got done really quickly, in time for students, so that we could actually present them with something really tangible, but you know, that kind of, I suppose, empowered them and their decision making at the right time when they needed it. So like the one thing we wanted to avoid, and I know a lot of people who work in UCD are familiar with that whole scattergun approach that students sometimes use, where they email 15 different people and without realizing they're using up, I suppose, just the time of 15 separate people, which is it's not a very efficient manner of finding out information. So the idea was to present it to them in a very simple form that let them go off, like it encouraged them to go off and really think about what they wanted to do. So hopefully that answers the question.
No, it does, for sure. I recognize that we've got 3 minutes left until the next session. So there's one question here that's really good that I want to ask. And then what we'll do is any of the remaining questions that haven't got a chance to be asked, what we might do is copy them over into the currents so that the conversation can continue there. And if people have questions, you can engage with the questions and answers there. But just as a final parting question, anyone can jump in and answer this if you want. It's one from John that's kind of echoed in a couple of other questions that are up there. What's an obvious learning now, or what's something that jumps out at you now that you'll use in the future? The question is phrased as something that you learned a bit late but seems an obvious learning now that you'll use in similar exercises in the future.
Who wants to answer that?
That's quite a difficult. It's quite a difficult question, and actually, an obvious learning that we would use in the future.
What I would say is, I know this isn't answering your question fully, John, but one thing that I learned from the whole process is that I learned a lot from it, not necessarily late, but just to what Amy was talking about, consulting, like having the group and bouncing ideas around the group, seeing what worked, what didn't work, and then consulting with lots of different units around the university, so that we came up with solutions that ended up working out. Actually, you know, there wasn't, I know there's a question there about change the contingency plan. Some things had to be changed a little bit when we got in contact with students. For example, a BA International Modern Languages student who was studying German and Spanish, and she didn't want to go on exchange any longer, and she wanted to transfer to the 3-year BA, and there isn't a German and Spanish on the 3-year BA, so that had to be created for her. So we came across kind of challenges like that, but I think we avoided a lot of the late learning by being so proactive and consulting with colleagues early on in the process.
Great, thanks, Ruth. I'm going to have to cut you off there because we're at 11, but that was really interesting. There's obviously some questions remaining, so we'll look to get this conversation flowing in the currents as well, and hopefully get some of the answers that haven't been answered there. But thanks a million, Ruth, Gillian, and Amy. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you.